Welcome everyone to our second afternoon session on the first day of Conclave 2018. I have the significant pleasure to announce at his first speaking gig at our Conclave sessions, the Reverend Mr. Jonathan Christopher Stewart, who will be initiating people into his secret order of RMJCS later in the week. Jonathan is the narthex leader of our Montreal narthex, which is called Holy Grail narthex. And we are very pleased to have him speaking on the Demiurge in the Gospel of St. John. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thank you, obviously, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to start off, I don't have slides. If I did, I would put up a short video clip, but instead I'll open with a quote. It's Han Solo in The Force Awakens. I used to wonder about that myself. I thought it was a bunch of mumbo-jumbo. A magical power holding together good and evil, the dark side and the light. The crazy thing is, it's true. The Force, the Jedi, all of it, it's all true. Has everybody seen that movie where the hardened cynic finally confesses to the power and the truth of the Force? This was kind of my experience researching this and coming across this research and realizing that the Gospel of John actually is a Gnostic text. It's all true, folks. There's also a traditional invocation, sort of like a prayer that's often said at the beginning of conclave lectures by different people. And it's, I'm not a scholar, but. So I'm going to invoke those magic words. Because we actually, of course, do have scholars speak. You know, we have Mark Thomas, who is a scholar. I have an undergrad in religious studies. I'm not a scholar. This is particularly important for me to bring up because part of this presentation does rely heavily on some Greek, and I don't speak or read Greek. So I'm relying on somebody else's research, so you're just going to have to take my and her word for it. I was talking to Clark before the presentation. That would be Harvard-trained scholar Clark, and he does agree that the Greek does check out with the interpretation that I'm going to push towards you folks. The majority of this presentation is based on 3 works by Dr. April DeConnick, one of my favorite biblical scholars and religious scholars out of Rice University in Texas. I'll ask His Eminence when he posts this. Some of this work is actually available free online, so we can put a link in, and those who want to see the arguments better presented than I'm going to present them, or those who can read Greek, can just go to the papers and check themselves. There's a long history, almost 2,000 years worth, of understanding the Gospel of John as a Gnostic text. Okay? But this is usually kind of viewed as something that a bunch of obscure, weird, heretical groups do, right? It's obviously a Orthodox or Proto Orthodox text, but for the last 2,000 years, these heretics keep saying that it is a heretical Gnostic text. So the Gospel of John was used, studied, and had a lot of importance for a variety of Gnostic groups in the first couple centuries of the modern era, right? So we have the Valentinians, we have the Cephians, we have the groups that we label and think of as Gnostic, using and loving this text. Then we have the Manichaeans, who, you know, come up in the 4th century. They become one of the world's largest religions, or the first world religion. They consider the Gospel of John to be a Gnostic text. We had the Cathars, who we just heard about. The Cathars argued that the Gospel of John is the only true inspired gospel. Okay, we're going to skip ahead to Palaprat in France in the early 1800s, who again is making claims about the Gospel of John being perhaps he wouldn't use the word Gnostic, but it's very important to him and to his movement. And then we go to Douanel, who, through a series of visions, established a Gnostic church in France. And in his visions, Douanel received this message, among many others, which is, you will take as your gospel the 4th, that of John. As a thought experiment, I've often argued that if we didn't have the 4th gospel, if we didn't have the Gospel of John, in our Bible. If it had been discovered in the Nag Hammadi, then all the scholars would just be like, oh, here's another, obscure Gnostic text that doesn't have anything to do with the historical Jesus, and they would just lump it in with those other texts. But that said, that's definitely not how it's been treated, except for these groups that I just listed, right? It's become a very important part of mainstream Christianity for 2,000 years. It's studied, understood, and interpreted by some of the great minds of the mainstream church for the last 2,000 years. And in this day right now, there's literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of books and articles written about it as an Orthodox Christian text by both people who are religious and by biblical scholars. Before I get into it, that's a preamble. I do need to have another preamble because of some texts we're going to be dealing with from the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, of course, is the book of love. That was also into an L's vision. You should take the fourth Gospel because it is the Gospel of love. If you open it up, you find many, many, many references to love. And that's why it can be very disturbing for modern readers to crack it open. I've been told about this wonderful, esoteric, mystical text full of love, and find these rather disturbing passages about the Jews, to use the language of the gospel. And the Jews are always out to get to Jesus, and Jesus is always talking to the Jews. And I'm not going to excuse the Gospel of John. It has, over the centuries, sort of been used to power and inflame hatred. But I'm not going to excuse it, but I'm going to try to put it into context just a little bit. Because there's a good chance that the writers of the Gospel of John were what we would now call Jews as well. Okay? There's a good chance that what we're looking at is different groups who have a similar ethnic background, who have a similar religious background, who are arguing with each other. And the writer of the Gospel of John has decided to call his opponents the Judeans, which we translate as the Jews. There's probably a few different reasons why he decided to label them the Judeans. We're going to get into it later in the talk, but a big influence and a big early component of the Johannite community came from the northern kingdom of Israel, Judah, of Palestine. And they were Samaritans, and they had a long history of fighting and arguing and not getting along with the Judeans. We also find interesting stuff in the Gospel of John when he's talking to somebody that we would now call a Jew, and the writer seems to like them. He refers to them as an Israelite, right? So this is not anti-Semitism as we know it. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm just trying to put it into context. As you all probably know, or many people in the room know, the Gospel of John was also written in a context of religions fighting among each other, where people were getting kicked out of the synagogues. So we had these, what we would now, refer to as Jews, people of a similar religious and ethnic background, showing up in the synagogues and spreading their message about Jesus and then being kicked out. We've known about this for a long time because it gets written into the Gospel of John as a prophecy, right? Jesus says, you're going to go to the synagogue and talk about me and people are going to kick you out. So that has led scholars to say, well, you know what? He probably wasn't seeing into the future. This is probably happening when the community is writing his story, right? So does anybody have any questions about that before I move on? That's more or less clear. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to mention that's essentially the Brown hypothesis that the anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic language possibly wasn't a part of the original thing and didn't happen in Jesus' time, but was more evidence of the conflict being written into the past by the people who were having it at the time that the gospel was compiled. So essentially, they were legitimizing their struggle by putting it in the mouth of Jesus.
Precisely. And again, we don't quite have the same ethnic racism that we associate with anti-Semitism now. These are people who are speaking a common language, have some common religious ideas, and probably have what we would now call a similar ethnic background. But I do have to get that out particularly for when people are watching this at home, right? Yeah. Double-sided. So, kind of proving that the Gospel of John is a Gnostic text in the way that Gnosticism is commonly understood, the shorthand for Gnosticism. As I already illustrated, it was considered by many groups for the last 2,000 years to be a Gnostic text, but the mainstream does not consider it so. So, for a little bit of proof, it does hinge on just a few lines, a few passages to get the proof out. And again, this is Jesus is talking to a group of people that the writer of Gospel John calls the Jews. They're getting into Jesus is talking about his father that they don't know, and they're saying stuff like, "Well, we are the children of Abraham." There's a discussion about parenthood. And Jesus says, and this is in the Standard Translation, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies." Sorry, pretty heavy stuff. So, kind of a disturbing passage in our modern context. But the funny thing about this passage is that it is mistranslated. And this is how you would read this passage in just about every modern Bible. What the Greek actually says is something much more like this. "You are from the father of the devil, and you want to carry out the desires of your father. That one was a murderer from the beginning, and he did not stand by the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks from his own nature, because he is a liar, and so is his father." Does everybody hear the difference? It's subtle, but it's pretty big. "You are of your father the devil, and you are from the father of the devil." How can the devil have a father? In a lot of Gnostic systems, there's the Demiurge, and then the Demiurge has a son who is the devil, and the devil runs the world for him. And that seems to be what is hiding in the Gospel of John. The Demiurge is in charge of the cosmos. His son, the devil, runs the world. Okay? The true Father, the Father of light, the good God, lives above all of that, above this world, above the Demiurge, and sends his son Jesus to let people know the truth, to get people out of the prison that is this world. And if you do kind of a plain reading of the Gospel of John, I don't really like the words common sense because it's kind of a weasel term. But if you read the Gospel of John with this interpretive lens, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because they constantly talk about the ruler of this world. They constantly talk about how this is a world of darkness. They constantly talk about how Jesus has a father that no one knows and who no one has ever known, and that this father is of light and of love. And when I first read this, it kind of blew my mind because it felt like a secret had been kept from me. And it's a secret that's been being kept from us for thousands of years. Now, translation is tricky, right? You could make the argument that, well, maybe when people are translating the Greek into English, it's a little dicey, it's a little hard to understand, and you are from your father the devil, and you are from the father of the devil. Those sound pretty similar in English, so maybe it is just a translation thing, right? Words are flexible. But no, it doesn't seem to be that way. It seems to be pretty definite that you are from the father of the devil. We have some very, very, very fascinating evidence to this, because in the first 400 years of Christianity, we have the the Orthodox or Proto Orthodox, the more mainstream Christians, reading the Bible in Greek with this original phrasing and admitting that, yes, that's what it says. And then they have to get all wibbly-wobbly trying to say, well, that's what the Greek says, but that isn't what it actually means. One of the more interesting things is actually our good friend Origen, who gets lumped in with the Proto Orthodox, but he's sort of between. He's a very mystical Christian. He's between the two schools. We even have him as in our liturgy, but he's generally considered within Orthodox spheres. And he wrote some sort of heresiologist-like writings against the Gnostics. He did a commentary on John, and he tackles this phrase. And Origen, who had a great mind, right? Well, one of the great geniuses of his time. So he says, yes, this is 100% what it says in Greek. It says, you are from the father, the devil. But that's probably not what they meant, and you shouldn't read it that way. Just read the father, your devil. So he just hand waves it, right? The great mind of his generation just goes, Close enough. Hey, that's what the Greek says, but they probably couldn't have meant that. You also get lots of interesting stuff with the heresiologists. You have Epiphanius. And he says, oh, well, you know what? Somehow that it does say father of the devil, but actually they're talking about Judas in that passage. But there's no reference to Judas before or after that, but somehow he's put in there. Some of the other heresiologists, again, they're not changing the translation. They're not saying your father the devil. They're still saying father of the devil. So it's very important. They're still using the original Greek, right? They're not covering it up. They're just giving really lame explanations. Some of the other really lame explanations are, that's actually about the Antichrist. Well, there's no mention of the Antichrist before or after that passage, but it's actually a reference to the Antichrist. So we have almost 400 years of this before it's forgotten about, and that's partly because a lot of these people are speaking and writing in Greek. Right? So you have to confront the issue. The Bible's not being translated. Oh, we even had I forgot one. We even have Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, who uses that passage as proof of the Demiurge being in the Gospel of John. And one of his Orthodox components says that it was that's symbolic that we all become the father of the devil when we sin. Right? So it's, yes. I know the people at home can't see it, but I see some faces scrunching up going, huh? I find it also that it's usually the Gnostics who are accused of being the ones who twist a passage around to get a symbolic reading out of it instead of just reading what's on the page. And here we have people kind of wrapping themselves all up in loops to say some pretty ridiculous things. Augustine as well. Augustine just said, he did a hand wave. He just said, that's what it says in the Greek, but don't worry about it. So he doesn't even use his vast intellect to try to tackle it. Once the Bible starts getting copied and translated from the Greek, it just gets translated to you are the sons of the devil. We also have some more proof to this reading. And it's in the First Epistle of John, which is in the Bible. We've thought and known for a long time that the First Epistle, 1 John, is written by a more orthodox branch of the Johannites who's trying to get rid of any Gnostic ideas, saying you're reading the Gospel of John wrong. And the funny thing is he doesn't directly quote this passage, but he talks a lot about fathers, and he talks a lot about liars, and he seems to be referencing this text and saying, hey, it's all right. You're reading it. You're reading it wrong. People, you don't have to wait till the end. We can also have questions at any time. If people have any questions, feel free to shoot them out. So I guess having this information and having the Gospel of John, we can try to follow along with DeConnick about how she extrapolates the system that's there. She says that this text, it has a new Gnostic transcosmic theism, marked by the bifurcation of the Jewish God into a good, just Father who lives in the high heavens, and a malicious lawgiver who fathered the devil and is the ruler of the world. So this is an early strain of Proto-Gnosticism, without a full development of Platonic thought kind of smeared on top of it. So the true God is far away, but he's still in the celestial sphere, and he's immediately connected with the creation through his son Jesus. So this is just an early layer of Gnosticism. It actually leaves some questions, which get later answered by some of the other Gnostic groups, even some of the other Gnostic groups connected to the John traditions, because we don't really understand just by reading this text, like, well, how did we get here, right? Why is there a good God and an evil God? Why are we trapped in this world of matter? And that's where you get something like the Secret Book of John, the Apocrypha of John, right? Which goes in and explains all of this. It elaborates upon this system. For a long time, people also sort of refused to view this as a Gnostic text, because Gnosticism always had to come from somewhere else, was sort of an earlier idea, right? It's a late development. It's something that doesn't arrive to the middle of the first century. Where the Gospel of John is, some people put it as early as the 90s, or as early as the year 100. We know that it's a relatively early text because it's actually the first Bible fragment that we have is from the Gospel of John. That's the earliest one that we have. We know that Mark was written first, and probably Matthew and Luke, and John probably did come last, but it's still an early text. So some of the arguments against this being a Gnostic text is that it can't be a Gnostic text, because Gnosticism is something that comes a lot later, when all these different groups meet and all these influences come in. So acknowledging it as a Gnostic text kind of ruins all that. It makes Gnosticism a lot earlier, which I quite like. I'm also a big fan of April DeConnick. She talks a lot about the religious buffer and Gnostic spirituality. So we talked about academic trends earlier. There's an academic trend that the Gnosticism is a later Christian development. There's no such thing as a pagan Gnosticism in the first century. There's no such thing as a Jewish Gnosticism. But DeConnick shows that there is such a thing. She calls it Gnostic spirituality. And there's sort of an older view that you have to have an origin and a source, right? And then it spreads in a straight line. Well, what the DeConnick says, she talks about a religious buffer. So you have ideas from Plato, because everybody is speaking Greek, and everybody who is smart is reading Plato. So there's no such thing as just Platonics over here and Jews over here, right? If you're a smart Jew who can read Greek, you're reading Plato. You have Egyptian religion. All of this is going into the religious buffer. Gnosticism starts popping out of this almost spontaneously. Okay? The fireworks start going off. So you don't have to have that clear line. You don't need one group influencing this group, influencing this group. Instead, what's happening is you have this religious buffer, which is the right mix of religions for Gnosticism to start happening all over the place. And if you're wondering what it is that's causing the popcorn to pop, it's personal experiences. People are having Gnostic personal experiences, or their group experiences, probably through the mystery cults, right? They're going in, they're having these powerful spiritual, transformative experiences, and then they have the right religious buffer to interpret what it is that these experiences mean. And then Gnosticism starts happening. All the elements are there. The spark that makes the powder keg explode is the personal experience. Now, as I said, we can throw out that sort of old idea of you need a straight line, and this group has to influence this group, has to influence this group, right? But that said, cross-pollination does start happening. This group has some Gnostic experiences and Gnostic ideas. They're drawing from the religious buffer. So they're speaking a language that's quite familiar to this group over here, right? And then they're cross-pollinating. keeping on with the Gnosticism of the Gospel of John, we've also known for a long time, that I mentioned before, that the Samaritans play a big role in the Gospel of John. And the theory is that the Samaritans were an early converts to Johannine Christianity. We do know of a very important Gnostic leader who's around a contemporary of Jesus Christ named Simon Magus. He does appear in Acts in the Bible. And Simon Magus was a Gnostic visionary. He had a Gnostic system where he believed that the world was created by evil angels that were imprisoned here. He, as we were talking about before, off camera, he believed that Sophia, wisdom, was trapped on earth and that he redeemed her. He actually found her. She's reincarnated into every generation. And she was important people in history before. For instance, she was Helen of Troy. And Simon Magus found her in this life, and the two of them together started a movement. So Taconic actually proposes that the Simonians, probably after Simon Magus dies, convert to Johannine Christianity, right? They bump into the Christians. They enter their community, and they bring in their Gnostic ideas. And this is one of the major influences of the Gnosticism that's found in the Gospel of John. These new converts, they were not blank slates. They already had preconceptions of the world as a hostile place controlled by fallen angels who had imprisoned God's Spirit within the human body. The teachings about Jesus, the prophet and Messiah, which they received from Jerusalem missionaries, were blended into the pre-established Gnostic frame, powerful miracle worker and healer who was God's Son, Simon Magus, sent to reveal the all-knowing Father and redeem the human spirit, which was a piece of God trapped in a dark world. This is how, in the fourth world, the prophet and Messiah Jesus becomes God incarnate. One last sort of interesting secret, one last bit of, if not proof, like this mistranslated Greek text. Something interesting that kind of points to the Gnostic identity of this text is a gentleman named Cerinthus. Cerinthus was a Gnostic leader who is traditionally thought to be a contemporary of John, who lived in what we now call Turkey. Okay, and sorry, just give me a moment here to find my info on Cerinthus. So he was accused of taking the Johannine tradition by his opponents and reinterpreting it in a Gnostic way, right? So the Proto Orthodox said he took the Gospel of John and he perverted it, and he created a Gnostic system out of the Gospel of John. Okay, but something interesting about this Cerinthus, this great heretic, this guy that the Proto Orthodox claim perverted Johannine Christianity, is there's at least 4, possibly more, ancient traditions coming from different groups that didn't like the Gospel of John, so maybe this is tainted a little bit, but they said that Cerinthus wrote the Gospel of John. So this great Gnostic leader was the one who actually composed it. I already mentioned the Epistle of John. There's also an ancient tradition that the Epistle of John was written to correct Cerinthus. So putting some of those data points together, the Gospel of John might have actually been written by somebody whose name that we know, or at least a version of the Gospel of John. We know that the Gospel of John has gone through a few different edits and rewrites because we can see the seams. For instance, Jesus sometimes teleports around ancient Palestine. He's in one place and he's in another. You don't have to be a great biblical scholar to notice that what they sometimes call the second ending in the Gospel of John seems to be tacked on. And that's where you also get some more Peter material, and that's also where you get Doubting Thomas. So that does seem that when this was adopted by the Proto Orthodox, that they cleaned it up a little bit and they put sort of an Orthodox sheen on it. Talking about this, as I said, this kind of blew my mind I think it's really cool. I think it's practical spiritually. Oh, go ahead, Clark.
Yeah, what is the time frame for Corinthus?
Oh, he's thought to live around 100, so 108 Common Era.
So he would have written this, but we are predating. John is commonly dated before that.
Yeah, it's commonly dated like 90 to 100.
Yeah.
So we're in the right time frame ish.
Oh, yeah, I see. What
Yeah.
you're saying.
But thank you. Okay, so it does sound like, as I said, I am a little upset, and I've been sad that this secret has been kept from me, that this is actually a Gnostic text. But you know what's great is, and that's also something too. I guess I'll back up. There's sort of like a common legend that what we call the Proto Orthodox became the dominant Christians through suppression and burning and hating, and then they construct the church that we have today. And maybe there's some truth to that later on. But the early church, who called themselves Catholic, which means universal, they wanted everybody to come together, right? They wanted there to be one Christianity for everybody. And that's probably why they didn't just junk the Gospel of John, because they saw some value in it, and they saw some value in the Johannite. So instead of junking it, suppressing it, hiding it, and they were still a fringe group for hundreds of years, they adopt it. They bring the Johannites in. They bring in their scriptures. They put their own interpretation on it. And I think that's really important and beautiful, and I'm really glad that they did, because of course the Gospel of John has been inspiring mainline mystics for thousands of years now. So don't let my peevishness influence you too much, because this is a wonderful thing in some respects, that this text was adopted, right, and that it has become part of the universal church. Something else as well. Like, I don't want to be a first-century Gnostic. Like, there's ideas both in the Gospel of John and in some of the other Gnostic texts that, as a modern pluralistic person, that I wouldn't adhere to, right? Like, I don't want to be a Cephian role player, So, something else that we sort of owe a debt to the Proto Orthodox is, as I mentioned before, the first epistle, the first letter of John, was written to sort of de-Gnosticize the Gospel of John. And also, as we know from Raymond Brown eminence, it's often thought that there was a split in the Johannine community, right? So some went off with the Orthodox, and some went off with the Gnostics. DeConnick actually kind of flips it around. She actually says that I think in Brown's system, it's people become more radically Gnostic, and then they leave to go be Gnostics, right? In DeConnick's view, they're already Gnostics. It's actually the people who want to be more Orthodox who split off. They're the ones who leave, right? So they leave, and they write the first epistle of John to sort of carry on some of the themes and the mysticism that's found in John, and the incredible... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Brown does agree that it is the more Orthodox folks that write the epistle.
Yes.
They agree. They agree in that regard.
Yes, 100%. And I think that's fairly obvious, again, from a quote-unquote common sense reading. If anybody here in the room, you don't need to be a scholar. If you read those two texts, then I agree with those two scholars. So the first epistle, John, is the one that's more Orthodox, right? Which apparently as heretics we should be scared of. But of course, the first epistle of John has some beautiful, amazing, stunning writing about the power of love, right? About we may not be able to see God, but we see God here in other people, in our community.
They're still essentially, in Brown's hypothesis, they're still Johannite.
They're still Johannites.
They still, they some of the things that they, interpret with their, they interpret the same way as their kind of proto-Gnostic counterparts.
Yeah.
It's when you get kind of one rung out from that they begin to kind of, disagree.
Yes, precisely. And that's been a great gift to religion, to spirituality, to the Bible, to every Christian on earth. And as I said, we get a whole chapter about how love transforms, about how love is powerful, about how love is found in the community and in each other. And I'm not sure, we necessarily would have got that great writing and had that great writing, in the millions of Bibles that you can find in every hotel room around the world if the community hadn't split, right? So there's, even though I'm peeved that this secret was kept from me and has been kept from the world, in some ways, I am happy that the Gospel of John was adapted into the mainstream. It was tamed, right? It was too wild. It was too powerful of a text to be understood in its proper context. It blew too many people's minds. But even it being tamed and distributed has been a great gift. And even in its tamed interpretation, it's like a landmine, because it keeps going off. Because I mentioned before, we have thousands of years of these different groups who are not scholars, who don't necessarily know how to read Greek, who keep holding up this text and saying, this is a Gnostic text. They get it. They just understand it. The landmine goes off. I think that's basically what I have. What am I doing for time? Oh, wow, that was a lot shorter than I thought. Oh, yeah, questions?
Could you please give the chapter and verse of that from John
that
you cited in the beginning?
Yes, of course. It's, I have it right here in my notes.
John 8:44.
Oh, thank you, Clark.
Thank you. And which of the Proto-Orthodox books covers that particular point, the translation?
Yes, she has it in a chapter in her book called The Gnostic New Age. And then she goes over it in 2 articles, which she has free online, called Look Who's Hiding in the Gospel of John, and Why Are the Heavens Closed?
Thank you.
Jonathan, we got a question back here.
Yes?
Was that Corinthus or Sorensis?
Corinth? Yes, Corinth. Oh, yes. It's CERINTHIUS. Clark?
Did you read this stuff from Origin, or did you take it out of the article? The reason I'm asking is Origin says a lot of things about what Heraklion says, how they interpret John.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if you came across anything that Origin says that Heraklion says about any of this, if it's recorded.
I didn't, but it's interesting stuff to dig into, because what Clark was talking about, one of the first biblical interpretations we have is from a Gnostic Valentinian, like somebody writing down and being like, this is what it means, this is what this means, right? A Bible commentary. For a New Testament text, the first one we have is from a Gnostic Valentinian named Heraklion, and later Origin quotes him to...
Well, yeah, I don't think we have Heraklion's work, we just have what Origin says.
That's right, we just have it in quotes, yeah. But that's the earliest biblical commentary that we know of.
It's interesting because, if I remember correctly, when I looked at this years ago, Origin records Heraklion as talking about the community kind of... There are suggestions, perhaps, that a Johannite community would have formed over its interpretation of the text that already pre-existed a community.
Yeah.
And, which is my take on it.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm just reading my stuff into it. But anyway, it was interesting to think of that, and then thinking in relation to like something later, the Simonians would have come along, though I suspect this might be a bit of April Deconic's creative historical work, but I don't know.
It's a bit of a reach, and for her Simonian stuff, like as far as I know, she doesn't have any formal academic articles on it, and it's in the book Gnostic New Age, which is written for a general audience, and she doesn't really lay down much proof for it. It's a bit of a creative reach. But that said, it's not that far off, because, we have Simon Magus does seem to be a historical person, right? He's running around at this time. He's a Gnostic. He has a Gnostic system, and we know that a lot of Samaritans joined in with the Johannine community. That's generally accepted. That's kind of a mainstream academic thing. So the leap isn't that huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. She again is kind of leapfrogging off of Brown or disagreeing with Brown, where although I don't think it's a complete disagreement, where Brown really sees the community of John the Baptist kind of making up the early Johannites, right? So she's saying, no, it's probably the Simonians, it's probably these Samaritan Gnostics. Yeah. Oh, Eminence, sorry.
I had just a kind of, to gauge your opinion on it, and I wish Father Tony was here, because we were talking about kind of how the, when looking at a kind of, there's kind of gaps in time and some gaps in theology where you have, the Gospel of John and then the Apocryphon of John, and then possibly the Leviticon. And Tony made a comment some years ago when comparing the Leviticon to the canonical John. This is more of a John thing than a Demiurge thing.
Yeah.
But they tie in kind of, whether or not the Apocryphon could be legitimately considered a part 2 to the Gospel of John, and Tony said he thought that the Apocryphon was a part 2 to the Leviticon.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant.
And I was just wondering, kind of, I guess, where would you, I guess if you, if you take the view that, in the presentation that the Demiurge is in the Gospel of John, how far back, would you see the, kind of that kind of classical Gnostic view going in the Proto Johannite community, right from the beginning or somewhere in the, are they, I guess, how would I rephrase this question? If the gospel according to Brown is essentially kind of, a historical record or a between the lines of what's actually happening to the community,
Yeah.
that's writing it kind of thing, is this a community that acquires the Demiurge and Demiurge or classical Gnosticism, or is it something that was there from the beginning that they're making a record of?
I would argue it's there from the beginning, and they're making a record of it.
Okay.
Yeah, and you don't even need. Again, there's a lot of ideas that to have the Demiurge or even an evil Demiurge, you got to have it's got to come from Plato, right? You're twisting stars in the Neoplatonic gentleman here. Shaking his head at me. Sorry, people at home, you're missing a lot. But you got to have Plato, and you got to have
cutting and throat motions.
Yeah. You got to have this, you got to have that, right? And it all came later. But we have we have Simon Magus running around in the first century, right? Talking about evil angels running the world, and you have ideas in the Judaism of the time, and in the even earlier, like in the Second Temple period, of a lower angel creating the world, right? Because God is getting higher and higher. So you have a Metatron, you have a son of God, you have an angel who's not the highest God, who is acting on God's behalf, who's creating the world, right? This is a relatively common idea around this time, and even a couple hundred years before it, right? In Jewish circles.
Like making, keeping the idea of a remote divinity while adding in, a kind of loophole accessibility.
Exactly, right? So, and even talk about like what's happening to the community, right? They're being persecuted, they're being kicked out of the synagogues, the temple was just destroyed, things are not going very good. So it's pretty easy to follow the thought process, right? You already have the ideas that the earth was created by a lower angel or by a lower emanation. You look around and the world is a shitty place. Well, this creator, he can't be a good guy, right? so it's probably there from the beginning. However, it's a simpler system than what we would find in the Secret Book of John. The Secret Book of John, of course, notoriously has a very complicated system. If people have read that book, we talk about a lot of books here. You can just read that book for the rest of your life. I've only started to begin to comprehend that book, right? So I don't think we have a system like that. But to lead on to what your question, instead of just going off to a ramble, it very much is a sequel to the Gospel of John, because those people are picking up picking up this simpler Gnosticism, and it's still leading them questions, right? Because it's like, well, what happened before the world was created? We have the in the beginning, right? But it's like, how did we get in this mess, right? What is the nature of the Demiurge? Who is this Paraclete, this female Holy Spirit, right?
Yeah.
So they're picking up, and in the sequel, they're filling everything out, right? They're answering all these questions.
The other interesting thing, of course, is that the Leviticon, kind of purports to be a copy of a Greek manuscript, which itself was a copy of, something older, and let's there was the debate, is the Leviticon a forgery or not, or did Palaprat forge it? Is it a forgery? That's likely. Did Palaprat do it? Probably not.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I don't think. I think he got it earlier. But the interesting thing, of course, is that all we have is the French for that now.
Yeah.
If the Greek version is real and actually does exist, I wonder if it shares the same thing we've just talked about in terms of fathers and devils.
Yes, the father of the devil. Yeah. That I know. Well, we're going to find that Greek.
No, I don't think, but
Yeah, we're going to find that Greek version and find out. Actually, to keep dwelling on the Leviticon.
this is where you announce your History Channel series.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, jokes aside, folks, we're Indiana Jonesing to find that Greek original. So, we know that the second ending on John was tacked on later, and to be honest, probably all these texts, many biblical texts, went through a few different versions, right? And it's not necessarily always notorious, different groups coming in to put in their own agenda. Just stuff gets written and rewritten. Sometimes there are some very strong reasons why. As I said, in the second ending, you have some more Peter and Thomas material that seems to be coming from the Proto Orthodox. The second ending is tacked on. If you read the Gospel of John and don't go into the resurrection, if you read it kind of like how the Leviticon goes, the book goes just fine, folks. The first ending, the resurrection, also looks a little tacked on. So there might have been a version with no resurrection, right? And maybe that is the Leviticon, and that also sort of tacks in with ideas in the Gospel of John. So we talked about the Epistle of John, right, which is sort of the attempt to make it a little bit more orthodox. There's not ideas about Jesus dying for our sins as a sacrifice in the Gospel of John, right? That's not spelled out, but it's in the First Epistle of John. Strangely, I shouldn't say strangely, but it's kind of interesting. The kind of talks about one of the functions of Jesus' death is that when he is raised up, when he dies, his spirit, the aeon, is released. So you have the Demiurge, right? And then below him is the devil, and the devil runs the world, and the good God and the good cosmos is above all that. But the Demiurge and the devil is sort of blocking us off from that. When Jesus dies, his spirit raises up like a lightning, like a laser beam, and it cuts a path through those evil layers, so that we can get up there in the future through Christ. So that seems to be the point of his death, and the point, and that's why you don't necessarily need the resurrection. So if you kind of think about later on when you have the resurrection stories, and you need to write a text, if you have a Gnostic Gospel, John, that doesn't have a resurrection narrative in it, and you have some questions about the Gnostic system that's in there, and you have some further speculations because you've been reading Plato, it makes a lot of sense for the secret book of John to come along, right? And then that's the resurrection narrative for this earlier version of John. Any other questions? Yes, pray, please.
I'm curious, and this could be something way off base here, but you were talking about Gnosticism not needing linear connections because of the individual experience, and of course that's an area that I'm going to hone in on because it is the individual experience.
Yes.
However, I'm also wondering if the linearity that people would be looking for wasn't found in restoration kind of movement.
Mm-hmm.
If we're to believe Barker and people like this, we're talking about a restoration movement. Well, the passage that you're reading, I could just as easily apply that to Set and Apopsis from Egypt, for example. Wherein does that linearity come from? And is there a potential that we're just looking in the wrong place for it, is what I'm curious about.
Sorry, could you rephrase? So for the, could you rephrase that a bit? I'll get my stool.
So, if the early Christian church was attempting a restoration movement from a much prior religion, and they were drawing from older stories and older mythologies,
yeah,
and those stories and mythologies that traveled through multiple areas,
yeah,
wouldn't you also see it popping up in the same way, but you wouldn't see it popping up in a linear way? You'd see a connection through the experience of the stories themselves, and not necessarily these stories themselves.
yes, yeah. I think you're 100% right, and that's also what Barker says too. Like where there is sort of there's a lineage and there's these restoration ideas floating around, right? But they're being recombined in sometimes radically different, almost unrecognizable ways, because they're getting so widely distributed for a bunch of different reasons, from trade routes to schisms. Yeah. And I don't want to say too that there's no linear. Like obviously there's lineages and there's Gnostic groups leading from each other. But I just want to throw out sort of older ideas that it always has to go A, B, C, D, E, F, T, right? Because that's been sort of a problem with proving sometimes pre-Christian Gnosticism, because we can't always find the A exactly, right? I think that we have the A's and the B's, but it's a little harder to prove.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And as I was saying, you were reading from the book there in John. We could apply what you were saying about the son of lies from the father of lies.
Yeah.
Pretty much into Egyptian mythology as well.
Yes.
It translates over very easily, the same kind of frame.
Yeah.
And if they were trying to pull from that as a restoration, well, then you have that same kind
Well,
of
that's
thing.
where and maybe, it could be, of course, the occult Orientalism that you have in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, where everything that's cool, comes from Egypt. And but I mean, even then, the Johannite mythology, has it going back to Egypt. And if you look at some of the temple theology connections, where essentially the Christian liturgy is a restoration of temple practice, then it's going back to something earlier, which of course there were also temples in Egypt, and or at least two, that we know of. But I was going to say, I mean, the other thing, and of course this is where you get into myth and legend and hypothesis, and you're never gonna know the truth exactly. So it's going to be a bunch of romantic stuff that you can either adopt or not. But the idea of the underground stream, right? You see where it pops up, but you don't necessarily see where it travels.
Yes.
Underground. I mean, are there commonalities in experience? For example, like the Cathars, the Bogomils. Like, are there commonalities of things there? Certainly, there's lots of overlap, but the further back, the less you can kind of draw. And you can kind of sort of draw a connection between that and the thing which immediately came before, but not necessarily that and the thing before the thing before that. Like, I guess if that makes sense. So there's a certain amount of I don't know how to explain it, where the experience kind of bridges that, even if there isn't. I mean, I guess there's some people that don't consider the Cathars to be Gnostic and that they're simply dualist. Christians, I consider them to be Gnostic, but I'm not a scholar. But
Yeah.
but I think it's the commonality, their shared spiritual experience of that kind of reality which connects them.
Yeah.
I guess where I'm meandering on this is that the experience is a kind of linear thing of itself.
Yes. Yeah. 100%.
Even if there isn't a tactile connection between the two.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much, Reverend Mr. Jonathan Stewart. He's available for questions for the next 20 minutes while we take a break and get up, stretch your legs,